Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Sherry and you, Bob, and the archives for inviting me to give a presentation as part of the ArchiTreats. And I will say here that the State Archives it's one of the finest archival repositories anywhere in the country. It's been a delight working here. I've been to some other state archives, and they don't compare to this one at all. I'm going to talk today about my book, which just came out this month, just in time for this talk. I had my fingers crossed for months, hoping that would work out that way. It's Portraits of Conflict, a photographic history of Alabama in the Civil War. And in this, I've got over 230 photographs of Alabamians, most of them never before seen, and I use them to give the war a literal human face, so that the war is not just battles and campaigns and statistics, but I provide a generous selection of Alabamians and their ordeal in the country's greatest, most tumultuous military conflict in its history. And in doing so, I think I also provide a very good overview of Alabama in the war itself. So it's not just a bunch of photographs strung together, but there's a purpose behind it. I provide a loose chronological narrative using the images of these individuals to tell the story. Let me see if I will make this work right. There we are. Just a few statistics, speaking of statistics, and then to highlight how important it is to have photographs of the people themselves to give it that human face. Just for Confederate Alabama, based on the 1860 census, and Civil War historians are always thankful that the war happened a year after the 1860 census so that we would have all that information to draw upon. But the manpower pool in Alabama, the white adult manpower pool, was 126,000 between the ages of 15 and 50, which was the manpower pool. And believe me, there were people younger than 15 who were serving in the Confederate Army. But the overall Confederate manpower contribution was approximately 96,000, 81,000 volunteers, and about 15,000 conscripts. And I'll disabuse any misperceptions now about the war being made up of a lot of draftees. The draft is certainly very controversial, a topic I'm not going to get into in this talk, but most of the soldiers who fought in the Confederacy and in the Union armies were volunteers. Of that 96,000 is a 76%, that's how many were mobilized. That is a huge tapping of your manpower resources. 76%, 3 out of every 4 serving in the ranks at some point in time. And of that number, approximately 30,000 Alabamians perished in the war. So 1 out of 3, more or less, who served, and 1 out of 4 who would have been eligible to serve. So quite a human toll in terms of just numbers. But again, the point I'm trying to get here with my book is that the war is not just numbers, not just raw data, but let's put a human face to it. And I'll show you a selection here. This is by no means an exhaustive selection. I'll tell you now, of the 235 photographs I've got, for every one I've got, there was 3 or 4 photographs I had that just didn't make it in. And that's because I had a fairly rigorous selection process of determining which photographs would make the cut. First, the photograph had to be a good quality. All right, so a lot of them are terrible quality photographs. But then I also wanted to ensure that I could clearly identify who this person was, where they came from, how old they were, something about their family and their life before the war, and what unit they fought in. Because again, most of the photographs are of Alabama soldiers. I've got civilians in there too. But again, the lion's share of the photographs are of soldiers. But I wanted to be able to provide a biographical sketch beyond just their name or what unit they were in. And then I wanted to put them in a particular place and time in the course of the Civil War where I could provide a fairly compelling story about what the war meant to them at that particular point. And these two are an example. Edward Crenshaw and John Bankhead both fought at the Battle of Chickamauga, which was the bloodiest battle in the Western Theater. In September 1863, the Army of Tennessee won its one clear-cut victory over the Union Army at Chattanooga, northern Georgia. 18,000 Confederate casualties in that victory. And these two gentlemen served in it. And Edward Crenshaw, a 21-year-old law student from Butler County, serving in the 58th Alabama, fought in this battle. He was 21 at the time of the battle. And a ferocious fight, the details of which I can't really go into too much here, but I have his diary, and that's where I was able to find a story that I could link it. So it's not just Edward Crenshaw was at the Battle of Chickamauga. That's edifying, but only to a certain point. But let's find out what he was actually doing there. And he's part of an attack against the Union left flank, and he comments on the 19th of September as they went into battle. He says, "With loud and enthusiastic cheers, we waded into the Union ranks." And then there was a passage I especially like that shows the cool demeanor, the aplomb of this young man in the midst of a fight, because he recalled as he was attacking, he said, one of his quotes, "Passed a Chinese sorghum patch while double quicken, charged the enemy with 2 stalks apiece, one in mouth and one in hand. I was nearly starved." So even as he's going into battle, his stomach is grumbling, and he grab something to munch on as we go into the fight. And then he has that stalk out of his mouth, kind of a little cocky as he's going into the fight. Unfortunately for Crenshaw, this battle will end badly. Before it's over, he'll take a shell fragment to the face and suffer a deep laceration diagonally across his face. So this photograph here, obviously before that, the young handsome man, forever scarred by this conflict. It took him many months to recover. He would eventually go back into the fight, perhaps not as cocksure as when he went into it, but a grievous wound. As for the other gentleman standing next to him, this is John Bankhead, Hollis Bankhead, a 21-year-old son of a planter, a big planter from Marion County, fought in the 16th Alabama. At that same battle, different part of the battlefield. It's a huge battlefield, but he's sharing the conflict every bit as much as Crenshaw is. And he went into a night fight. Normally, you didn't see nighttime fighting in the Civil War. They just don't have the illumination and the communication to pull those things off very effectively. But he was part of an attack across a field. And in the confusion, he recalled, as he looked back on this battle, that the regimental commander in the dark barked out the command, "March in retreat." And Bankhead thought, what does that mean in the midst of the fight? And he and a couple of other company commanders said, well, we're not retreating, we're going to attack. So half the regiment attacked, the other half retreated in this chaotic nighttime fight. Bankhead and his boys actually took the enemy position they were trying to attack in the first place, and they sent a courier back to the regimental commander saying, you can come on across now, we made it. The next day, as the battle continued, an interesting story about the young man's heroism. The 16th Alabama would get pretty shot up the following day, over 200 casualties in the regiment, including Bankhead. His left arm was shattered by a shell fragment. It was hanging limp when the call this time to actually fall back and retreat was given pretty clear cut. And as they were falling back, he was toward the rear, making sure all of his men were shepherded safely to out of harm's way. And he saw one of his privates, not in his company, but in the regiment, lying in a burning field. The fire was coming up, and this wounded private, his legs were taken out, and he was calling for help. There was no one around. The Yankees were coming, but Bankhead nevertheless went over, and with his one good arm, he hoisted this guy up over his shoulder and carried him off the field in the fire and in the destruction all around him. But 21-year-old, both of them, 21 years old, remarkable leadership ability and courage in the face of one of the worst holocausts that the country has ever gone through. But as I say, the war is a chronological narrative. That was my selection process. Again, all of the captions, the entries, will be pretty lengthy like that, laying out in detail why I've selected this photograph and where it fits in the story. But I try to provide a general chronology. 1860. I have some stuff on the secession crisis, but for time constraints, I'll give you a snapshot of 61, 62, 63, 64, 65. Those are the main years of the war. And in 1861, we've got this photograph here, the 1st Alabama Infantry at Fort Barrancas, Florida. That's outside of Pensacola, one of the obscure theaters of the war. Not a lot of Americans who know about the Civil War know very much about what was going on in the panhandle of Florida. But in 1861, that was a hot spot because the Confederates wanted to try to get control of Fort Pickens outside of Pensacola so they could use it as a naval base. And the Confederates occupied Fort Barrancas, and one of the important units there was the 1st Alabama Infantry. And there are I've got a lot of individual photographs, but very few photographs of units, let alone Alabama units. And this is really probably a company from the 1st Alabama outside of their encampment in the vicinity of Fort Barrancas. But I put that one in there and tell the larger story of what happened there. But an unusual, a rare photograph to say the least, to be able to identify. You see photographs of guys standing around, but you don't always know where they're from. Incidentally, under the smaller font beneath each caption is the location where I got the photograph. Most of them are going to say 80AH because half of the photographs came from this wonderful collection here at the State Archives. Over here we've got Nathaniel Dawson. He fought at the Battle of First Manassas. There were 2 battles at First Manassas, and some of you may be familiar with the battle being called Bull Run. Confederates usually named a battle after the nearest town. The North, the Union usually named it after the nearest body of water. They weren't always consistent about that, but First Manassas, First Bull Run, same battle. Dawson, who fights there, is a 32-year-old lawyer and slaveholder from Dallas County, pretty well off. Fights in the 4th Alabama Infantry, one of the most storied regiments in Confederate Alabama history. And he's a hardline secessionist, too. And I use him in some other photographs to get, there's this perception that the Civil War, at least in the South, was a rich man war, a poor man fight, that the slaveholders started this whole war and then made all the yeoman farmers do the fighting. Well, that's very, very misleading. You see a large proportion of slaveholders fighting in this conflict, including Nathaniel Dawson here, whose wife, incidentally, Elodie Todd, is the half-sister of Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's wife. So and that's all goes back to the Kentucky ancestry that both families share here. So Dawson's married to the Confederate hardline secessionist, is married to the half-sister of the woman married to the president who is bringing the Union forces down upon Dawson's world. He fights at First Manassas, and again, to try to bring his story alive, I've got his letters that he wrote to his wife. He wrote a number of letters to her, very excited about the prospect of fighting and looking forward to the big fight. And he was especially proud of his brand new British-made 5-shot Adams revolver that he liked to carry around. He had just recently got it, and he was looking forward to using it, and he boasted to his wife and to some friends that he could hit a target at what I consider the fantastic range of 200 yards with his pistol. And he thought he was that good with it. And he talked about this pistol all the time. They go into the fight. Again, the battle itself, I provide context in the book itself, but it's the first big engagement. It's really more of a chaotic circus act as 2 inexperienced armies bungle around the battlefield. There's a lot of friendly fire in this engagement. But the 4th Alabama, it charges, and then it is in turn counterattacked, and it's in the course of one of these fights, Dawson is trying to organize a retreat. He stands up on a fence rail to get a better view. Cannonball hits the fence rail and sends him flying in the air. He said at least 10 feet, maybe more. He lands, bruised, sprains his ankle, and he's literally hopping around on 1 foot at this point, trying to get off the field. Eventually, they get back, fall back to a safe area. He goes to a field hospital, and then he writes his wife about how excited it was to be in this battle and what an honor it was. But then, in the part I love, is that he confesses with some embarrassment that in the confusion, he forgot to draw that pistol that he was so proud of and never fired it. So he was somewhat sheepishly admitted, yeah, I actually never shot that thing. Later on, he'd get a chance to use it, but he would go on to serve in the Alabama legislature in the second half of the war as a pro-war politician. 1862, these 2 photographs here, I use them again to contrast fame and obscurity. John Pelham, I'll point out here in a moment, if you don't already know this individual, one of the most famous Confederate Alabamians, the poster child, really, of Confederate Alabama, and then the very obscure Marcus Westbrook. And I'll talk about them in the setting I place them in is Pelham at the Battle of Fredericksburg, a bloody fight, one of Robert E. Lee's victories in Virginia, and then Westbrook fights at Murfreesboro. And both of those battles, incidentally, we are at the sesquicentennial of those 2 engagements. more or less, the 150-year anniversary. Fredericksburg was December 13th, Murfreesboro December 31st. The main part, there'll be a continuation of the fight on January 2nd of the following year, 63. But Pelham, he's a 24-year-old, I just have to describe him as a daredevil and heartthrob from Calhoun County, because he, by all accounts, is the girls of Calhoun County are seeking this guy. That he was a great horseman, a great athlete, and very smooth and charming with the ladies. Went to going to go to the University of Alabama, and then the war came, and he served most of the war as an artillery officer in Robert E. Lee's under the Army of Northern Virginia, and he was well known for having this remarkable ability to get his cannons at the right place at the right time and lay down deadly fire with the first salvo. It was uncanny. And he rose up to the rank of major, and at Fredericksburg, he, with a section of guns, that's 2 guns, went down and for a few hours was single-handedly bombarding the Union lines, and then the Yankee counter battery was trying to get him, and at least 6 batteries were firing at him, and he was displacing his guns and maintaining his cool, and all the while the Confederate Army up on the high ground is watching and cheering as Pelham is dodging the incoming rounds, and finally Lee says, let's bring him back. Sooner or later, one of these rounds is going to get him. But it was a big morale boost, and typical of Pelham's daredevil style. Unfortunately for him, for Alabama, for the South, the following year he would be killed in a skirmish, one of the young casualties of many casualties in this war. But again, another young guy doing amazing things, Pelham. And when I look at his story, and I try to think, how could someone so young pull all this stuff off? And it makes me think, to use a loose modern-day parallel of a football quarterback. This guy right here, Pelham, if he was alive today, would be a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback for some football team. Probably the University of Alabama, I guess. He's famous, and he was famous at the time. He's called the Gallant Pelham, and poems were made about him, and everybody was heartbroken when he died. But at the same time, Pelham is winning all these laurels. Marcus Westbrook is doing no less good service for the Confederacy as a private in the 19th Alabama, fighting at the Battle of Murfreesboro. He is a farmer, small yeoman farmer from Cherokee County. And a yeoman farmer, by the way, most white Southerners were yeoman farmers. That means they are non-slave-holding property holders. They have farms, they don't own slaves. And that's the majority of white Southerners. And Westbrook, so again, he has no slaves, so that aspect of why the war began is he's not vested to that. Go back to this rich man war, poor man fight. Westbrook is one of the poor men, but is very patriotic and enthusiastic about serving. And what I found interesting about him as I did research on him was he was on multiple occasions was offered promotion to sergeant, because he was a natural with just a natural soldier. He loved soldiering. Camp life, never complained, was always reliable, was always there on the march. Never had any health problems, so he's not on sick call or anything. And his officers were always wanting to promote him to sergeant, and he refused. He said, I want to stay a private. I want to be with the boys, sharing all the hardships. Before each battle, however, including at Murfreesboro, which is where I place him in the story, he would accept a temporary promotion to sergeant, just for combat leadership ability. And at Murfreesboro, he did that and was involved in the ferocious wooded fighting there. His unit got disconnected from the main body, but he was among the soldiers to keep the guys calm, as they didn't know where they were in the woods, and help guide them back to friendly lines. And then when the battle was over, he said, I'm a private again. And he never put the stripes on. So a selfless service, to say the least, on the part of Marcus Westbrook. 1863, moving the war along here at the halfway point. These 2 photographs I use in the context of Gettysburg. That should be a battle that we all know something about. Fort Barrancas might be obscure, but Gettysburg is probably the most famous battle of the whole Civil War. And I use these, again, you can do a tragicomedy with this, that there's a humorous side to war and there's a tragic side to war. And Adolf Proskauer, you can get a little bit of humor and lightheartedness. Adolph Proskauer, at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, he's a major in the 12th Alabama Infantry and would be part of the attack coming out of the north, going through the streets of Gettysburg itself. He is a bookkeeper from Mobile and is a German immigrant, and he's Jewish. So there aren't very many Jews in the Confederate Army. There aren't very many Jews in the Confederacy, but he is one, and he's very committed to the war effort. He's known, and this is a quote from one of the regimental histories, he was known as the best-dressed man in the regiment. And this photograph, I think, conveys how careful he is about grooming and his appearance. And he also had some particular affectations that endeared him to the men, because when they would go on campaign, he had a great fondness for fried mushrooms. And he would scour the fields and he'd try to find mushrooms. And he had apparently a good idea of distinguishing between edible ones and poisonous ones. And then he'd fry these things up and eat them as any chance he could get. But he was also a very capable commander. And in the first day of the fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg, where the 12th is in a stand-up fight with some Union forces just south of Gettysburg, they're trying to take Cemetery Hill, that missed opportunity for the Confederacy. But one of his captains, in the midst of the fight, recalled in the regimental history, says, "Our gallant Jew major smoked his cigars calmly and coolly in the thickest of the fight." And he was calm and cool. He used his horse, he dismounted and he used his horse to, like as an ambulance, to carry wounded people off the field. He would be wounded, he would take a shell fragment to the face, and so that again, another handsome face marred by a terrible war, which leads me into a segue into the tragedy of this conflict. We can have the lighthearted moments, the jovial moments, but people are dying, lots of them, tens of thousands. And this picture here is from the slaughter pen. It's a photograph taken by Alexander Gardner, actually. He worked with Matthew Brady, a famous photographer in the war. And Gardner came down and shortly after the battle took all these still shots. The slaughter pen is, if you know the geography of the Battle of Gettysburg, you've got Little Round Top to the south, and then you got Devil's Den, which was this big boulder-strewn piece of topography. And in between is a patch of land that became known as the slaughter pen, because on July 2nd, the 44th Alabama marched trying to get the Devil's Den and help outflank the Union position at Little Round Top, marched into this pit, and they were ambushed by soldiers from the 4th Maine. And in rapid succession, literally, Colonel William Perry recalled, he said within 20 seconds, according to him, 24 Alabamians were killed, another 66 were wounded, in just literally seconds. Miraculously, Perry was able to rally the regiment and counterattack from a different direction and drive the 4th Maine out of the Devil's Den area. But not without leaving a lot of men behind. These two, in all probability, I'm not 100% sure, but the records indicate that those two bodies, bloated bodies lying there, were soldiers of the 44th Alabama. We don't know their names, but they made a very real sacrifice that my book tries to honor. 1864. This is the year the war really comes to Alabama big time. Now, Alabama had largely been insulated from most of the war, 61, 62, and into 63. There were cavalry operations up in northern Alabama. The Union Army, intermittently got control of the Tennessee Valley. And of course, there's the naval blockade of Mobile. But for the most part, Alabama was relatively unscathed physically. Or you got the war in Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, this destructive arc around the state. But in 1864, Alabama is going to feel the hard hand of war. And these are a couple of images from my chapters on the home front and on Mobile. And in northern Alabama, we have Mary Jane Chaddock. This is a civilian and one of the few women in the book. As I was working on this, my wife would often say to me, "Where are the women? Where are the women?" Lots of men, lots of soldiers. All right, well, there are some women. It's a male chauvinist book, if you want to look at it that way, because it's heavy men. But Mary Jane Chaddock was the wife of a Confederate Presbyterian minister and who the 50th Alabama Infantry and was off and away. She's from Huntsville up in Madison County, and she feels the Union occupation directly when the region is overrun at various points in time. And incidentally, just to let you know, some of you may have come to an ArchiTreats a few months ago where Nancy Rohr talks about the diary of Mary Jane Chaddock and gives the full life story. I use that edited diary of Nancy Rohr to kind of capture some of the ordeal that Mary Jane's going through here. She hates the Yankees, to put it simply. You get that impression as you read through her entries, and she's dismayed by by kind of we would call them bummers, I guess, in Sherman's army, Yankee soldiers that kind of run around and loot and pilfer and intimidate the civilian population. She was convinced that that's all the Yankees came to do, because they would rummage around her property on the pretext of looking for contraband, and she'd always say, "You're just here to steal whatever you can find. Don't try to, disguise it as any other way." She's also very concerned because she has 6 slaves as domestics that work in her house. And with the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect in 1863, the slave population became restless, and you had hundreds of thousands of slaves wherever the Union Army went. A lot of times they would leave and congregate around the Union Army because they could sense that the destruction of slavery was inevitable, regardless of the ultimate outcome of the war, that somehow the war itself was just going to destroy slavery. And she had the slave she relied on the most was Corinna, who also had a 5-year-old son who was also a slave in the household. And Corinna, in 1864, finally just decided to leave. She wasn't going to listen to Mary Jane anymore, and she up and left. Took her son, went into Union lines, and said, "I'm free now, I'm gone." And a couple of the entries in the diary, one I couldn't help but cite, that Mary Jane said, after Corinna left, Mary Jane is fuming in her diary, "I had to cook for the entire family that night." Oh, too bad. But she goes on as in the whole course of the war, especially when she sees the Confederacy disintegrating. By the end of the year, she writes, she's just lamenting. The diary almost becomes a book of lamentations as you read along. And she says, "We cannot believe that a just God will suffer such an enemy to triumph over us." But by the time she wrote that, it was moot. It was obvious that the Confederacy was going down. By the way, at the time I used her entry, she's 42 years old. Her husband, she rarely saw him, because when he came back, he's a Confederate a Confederate officer. He had to lay low. He would have been arrested when the Union forces were around. The other photograph here takes us to South Alabama. Whoops, keep getting ahead of the game here. This is down around Mobile, and I've got a whole chapter on Mobile, but I'll use this as a kind of the centerpiece of the study. This is the Confederate warship, an ironclad, the CSS Tennessee, and that's where I got this photograph from, the Naval History and Heritage Command. The Confederacy doesn't have much of a navy, and they try to compensate for numerical inferiority by pursuing the technological fix. And they constructed a number of ironclads. Most famously is the CSS Virginia, sometimes known as the Merrimack, which fought up in Hampton Roads, up in the Chesapeake Bay area earlier in the war. But the CSS Tennessee was constructed to protect Mobile, not so much to break the blockade. The Confederate Navy realized they really didn't have the firepower to break the blockade, but they were hoping to at least be able to keep their ports open with these ironclads so blockade runners could slip in and out. And the CSS Tennessee was constructed, started in 1863. It's built in Selma. It's hard to believe that so far inland, but Selma was a navy yard for the Confederacy, and they built the Tennessee and sailed it down the Alabama River and got it into Mobile, where it became the flagship of the Mobile Squadron that would try in vain to stop the Union from taking the port. It's an impressive warship. It's 4 to 6 inches of armor plating. It's got 6 rifled cannon. Unfortunately, all this weight of armament and armor reduces it to a maximum speed of about 6 knots. So it's slow, it's lumbering. But that's the behemoth that's going to try to protect Mobile. And in August 1864, if you know the story, Admiral Farragut, the Union admiral, leads 18 warships. 14 are wooden, 4 ironclads. The Union have ironclads too. They run them past the guns at Fort Morgan, past a torpedo field. We call it a minefield today. He loses 1 ship, gets into the bay, and the CSS Tennessee comes lumbering out to try to contest this attack. There was a couple of other ships, small gunboats helping the Tennessee, but they were quickly scattered. And for the next several hours, about half a day, the CSS Tennessee by itself is battling this Union flotilla. Eventually, the smokestack gets blown off, it gets shot off, the steering chain gets snapped, and most of the gun portals get knocked closed. And finally, the ship has to strike its colors. It's never actually sunk. It's just simply incapacitated and becomes this wallowing piece of metal just sitting there when the Confederates end up surrendering the ship. And the bay falls. So it's a defeat. But I'll say a couple things about this, that this battle, the Battle of Mobile Bay with the CSS Tennessee, it's the largest naval battle of the Civil War. The Civil War is best known, rightly so, for huge land battles. But the naval aspect shouldn't be overlooked, and this is the biggest naval engagement of the war. And although the CSS Tennessee is defeated, against 15-1 odds, it's finally defeated. Even though it's defeated, this is going to be one of the last times wooden ships prevail over an ironclad, because once the technological improvements are made, the day of wooden ship and sailing ship are going to be gone. This is the future of naval warfare, even though it was in a failed cause at that point in time. Now 1865, last year of the war, last phase, where now Alabama is fully engulfed. Mobile Bay's fallen, the Union Army is moving up the east side of the bay, in part to finish off the business of Mobile, but to pretty much gut southern Alabama. At the same time, you've got huge Union cavalry forces coming in out of the Tennessee Valley, wreaking havoc. And one of the individuals trying to stop this Union juggernaut is Green Marshal Labazin. I think I'm pronouncing that name correctly. He's a 19-year-old cadet at the University of Alabama, part of the Corps of Cadets. University of Alabama was a military school that offered training facilities for the Confederate Army. Labazin is abruptly awakened in the wee hours of the 4th of April, 1865, and he's notified that there's a Union cavalry column heading toward the campus. And so he shakes down. He was a cadet lieutenant in charge of some soldiers, and this is the uniform he struggled into. It was pouring rain when he went out onto the compound. It's pitch black dark. There's no lighting out here, and he's told to lead a skirmish line through the campus and to try to locate where the Yankees are and help drive them back. And in the midst of that nighttime operation, he did indeed encounter shadowy figures and opened fire and shot at sounds and shadows as best he could. Before the dawn, however, the president of the school and other higher-ranking officers determined that these handful of boys were not going to be able to stop the hardened veterans of these Union cavalry forces, and they evacuated the campus and they left. And so Labazin, when he looked back on it, he always said he was glad to have actually finally been able to participate, because he knows the war is winding down and he's finally got his chance to see combat. But then he goes on to say, but I didn't actually see combat. It was pitch black. He fired into the night. But he said he made his contribution. He did his part. Young 19-year-old man. The other gentleman over here, Jonathan M. Stewart, is a 29-year-old farmer from Randolph County originally. Now he's unusual because he's a Unionist. He fought in the Union Army. He joined the 1st Alabama Cavalry Union. There was about 2,500 Alabamians served in the Union Army. You got 96,000 in the Confederate Army, but there were Alabamians. Some scholars have estimated as many as 10% of the population would have identified itself as Unionist, meaning not only are they opposed to secession, but they want Lincoln and the North to march and prevail and the Confederacy to go down, so much so that they actually join. They join the Union Army, and they feel, no, they're not committing treason as far as they're concerned. It's guys like this are the traitors, and he's one of the loyalists. I say he's from Randolph County. That's in the eastern part of the state on the Georgia border, a farmer from there. The rest of his family was pro-Confederate. His brothers, when they said, we're going to go join the Confederate Army, he said, I'm not. And they said, well, you got two choices. You will join or you need to get out. And so a family literally torn apart. This is brother versus brother here. And Jonathan went to Lawrence County up in the Tennessee Valley about the time the Union Army came through and enlisted into the newly raised 1st Alabama Cavalry. And in 1865, while Green Marshal Labazin is vainly trying to protect the University of Alabama, the campus would fall and the Union Army burned most of it down. But at that time, Stewart is with Sherman marching through the Carolinas. He was part of the cavalry unit there, engaging in various cavalry operations. So again, a portrait of conflict. His conflict is every bit as legitimate as all of the Confederates, even if he is in the tiny minority of Unionists in the state at that time. I want to get us into Reconstruction. I got 2 more slides here, but I at least want to get through this one. Reconstruction, because I continue on. The war doesn't end in 1865, not as far as I'm concerned. The Reconstruction period is a militant continuation of the war. There is a lot of ongoing enmity and paramilitary strife that mars Reconstruction because of the revolutionary nature of what the war brought. Not only has the South been militarily defeated, although the white South always psychologically maintained it's not because our cause was unjust, we just got overpowered. There was never a formal surrender, there was never a treaty signed. So as far as the white South was concerned, they simply were just broken down by the North's industrial and population weight. There's also the revolutionary aspect of the Emancipation Proclamation, which in Alabama freed over 400,000 slaves, for whom Reconstruction is an exciting and hopeful time. For most ex-Confederates, it is a nightmare experience. And I use these 2 photographs to contrast the ongoing possibilities and enmity that characterized the Reconstruction years. Jeremiah Harrelson, a 28-year-old freedman from Dallas County. He's a slave who then gained his freedom and joined the new Republican Party that established itself in Alabama. There was no Republican Party until Reconstruction. Carpetbaggers and scalawags, to use those terms, established the party and used it to mobilize the freedmen as voters and as politicians. And Harrelson joined and moved quickly through the ranks of the political ranks in the state. There was something very there was an aggressive side to Harrelson. He really embraced his freedom and saw himself, I'm not just free, I'm equal, and was very active at trying to promote all kinds of social programs and social equality within the state, especially in public facilities. He was determined. He served in the state legislature and would serve in the U.S. Congress. He's one of 14 African Americans who served in the U.S. Congress during Reconstruction. 2 were senators, both from Mississippi and Louisiana, and then you had 14 congressmen. Harrelson's one of them, and he had a devoted following of former slaves in Dallas County and the surrounding area. And he was also could be inflammatory because he did not shy away from confronting ex-Confederates and letting them know he was free. In 1868, there's a story where he went around the county announcing that he was running for president of the United States. He's 28 years old, but that was beside the point. It was less that he was really going to win, and more he just wanted to tick off the ex-Confederates and let them know that a new age had dawned. And Harrelson, he would serve in the U.S. Congress in the mid-1870s, although he found when he got to Congress, the majority whites there, in his own party, not to mention the Democratic Party, largely ignored him. I mean, they gave him no important committee assignments. They wouldn't let him speak on the floor. All they did was come around. The Republican majority whip would say, "Okay, we're voting now. You're voting with the Republicans." That's all. He learned a lesson when he got to Congress that liberty and equality are very different things. He also ticked off this individual from Dallas County, Charles M. Shelley, who at the time in the mid-1870s or 1874 was a 40-year-old former brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He commanded the 30th Alabama, had fought at Vicksburg, had fought in the Atlanta campaign, had fought at Nashville, He's got an impressive Confederate military resume. He hates this guy's guts, and they reciprocate the feeling. And Charles M. Shelley, even though the district is majority black, he was able to finagle an appointment as sheriff of Dallas County. Rather than the normal process of an election, which he would have lost, he got a gubernatorial appointment from the Democrat governor at the time. And he used his position as sheriff. All of the deputies he hired were former soldiers under his command, and he moved through the county, engaging in a campaign of intimidation against Harrelson and his followers. And in the 1876 race for Congress, Shelley, who knew Harrelson was so popular, had his deputies arrest him. At Cahaba, he was arrested, and Harrelson was tied to a chair, and according to this was a congressional investigation, Shelley stuck a pistol in Harrelson's face and said, "You goddamn black son of a bitch, I'll murder you right here if you don't get out of this race." And Harrelson said, "Okay," and left, ran anyway, technically won on the face of the returns, but Shelley, as the sheriff, took control of the registrar's office and determined that a number of the polling places had voter fraud, threw those votes out, and Shelley, who was running as well, prevailed in the election. Shelley becomes the new congressman. And then the Democratic Party, which toward the end of Reconstruction gained control of the legislature, they rezoned everything so someone like Harrelson would never have a chance of winning again. He ended up leaving the state and heading out west, while Shelley would serve 4 consecutive terms in Congress. The last slide here end on a happier note than on the animosity that portrayed that was the story of Reconstruction. I'll finish with this last slide about a reunion. This is a photograph of the 28th Alabama Infantry. In 1908, they gathered in Birmingham. There was no Birmingham in the Civil War. That city is founded in the 1870s, but they gathered there, 33 surviving veterans, and the most significant thing I want to point out here is the flag. That's the flag of the 28th, and I put this in here to demonstrate that the battle flag that we associate with the Confederacy is always the St. Andrew's Cross. I think you know what I'm talking about here. That flag was prevalent in the Army of Northern Virginia under Lee. There was a lot of those types of flags out west, but in the Western armies, there was a greater diversity of flags. And this is an example. You can't tell, it's not a color photograph, but this was a golden starburst on a white silk background. And this is the flag of the 28th, atypical of the flags we normally associate with the Confederacy. But there's my selection, my snapshot of Alabama during the Civil War. Thank you.
We have time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will take the microphone to you to speak directly into the microphone, because we do have an overflow room and it needs to also be recorded on the video. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the cover photo.
Okay.
Why was and I assume he's in this photo actually.
Yes, he is.
Captain John Henry Turpin, what was the reasoning behind choosing him?
So I leave him there because if you want to find out more about Turpin, you got to buy the book. No, that's just, he's one reason. This was I was working with Bob Bradley. We were trying to figure out what would be a good cover for the book, because University of Arkansas Press always, for the other volumes, they've got one on Mississippi, Louisiana. They always have one of the figures from the state. And Bob and I agreed that this is one of the most striking photographs. Just standing there, arms crossed. This is John Henry Turpin. He was a 25-year-old druggist from Greene County. He served in the 28th Alabama Infantry, and in the book itself, I use him in the context also at the Battle of Murfreesboro, where this striking image of him here, he was a company commander, a captain, and at the Battle of Murfreesboro, he would be shot through the left arm, and almost from the shoulder down, he would lose that arm. But we could have used any number of photographs, but we both Bob and I agreed this one looks best, and I think it does. It's a proud, defiant image typical of the early, heady, exciting days of the secession crisis and the Civil War itself, and the press agreed and put it on there.
Well, I want to thank you. He was my great-grandfather.
Oh, wow, okay. Well.
In the photograph of Westbrook, I believe his name was,
Yeah, okay.
I'm interested to know what is that in his left hand. To be a pistol, the barrel is too long.
That's like a long sword, or like maybe a short-handed sword, or a, okay.
A Bowie knife?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the full details of that. Bob's really the guy to go to there.
It's a D-guard Bowie knife, and all the guys in that regiment were wearing those swallowtail frocks. In each of the photos, they're wearing the same belt and holding the same gun with the same bayonet. In other words, those are studio props.
Yeah, and that's what, and that's, I'm glad you brought that up, Bob, because the photographs, I tell the personal story of the individual. I don't analyze what they're wearing for precisely that reason, because I don't know if he actually carried this in battle, and apparently he didn't. Everybody in the 19th was posing with this, and you get a lot of studio props. So I refrain from commenting on the accoutrements that they had in the photograph. Yes, sir.
Mr. Severance, I really enjoyed your talk today, and you really bring it to life with your
Thanks.
Severance. But how much time did you spend on this classic work? And I'll say that before I read it, but I believe it will be.
The question is how long I spent working on this. A lot longer than I anticipated, I'll tell you that. Almost 6 years. And I mean, part of that, I'm not making excuses. I'm also a teacher and doing other projects as well. But it just, when I talked to the University of Arkansas Press and signed the contract with them, Larry Malley, who's the editor-in-chief, joked with me and said, "Can you get this done in a year?" And I said, "Give me 2." And then 6 years later, it finally came. It just took a long time to not only find the photo. A lot of them were already here in the archives, but it was finding the appropriate information to bring it alive. So it wasn't just a photograph. I could have used all the photographs and just given their names, but I wanted to have a compelling story to go with each one, and that was where the painstaking research came in. Believe me, I wish I could have got it done a lot sooner than that.
Since you got to tell them, I'll ask a question. I may have misunderstood you, but you said that he had gone to the University of Alabama, and that may well be true, but I do know that he was at the military academy at
Yes,
West Point.
as you say that, I was going to use Robert Coles, who wrote a history of the 4th Alabama. He was at the University of Alabama, and you're quite right to catch that
Yeah,
that,
had a
that
heck of a
glitch.
time getting south.
There was the West Point. That was where.
And you notice his uniform has a rather almost a stovepipe hat, and I believe that must be an extremely early photo, perhaps with Union blue rather than Confederate.
Probably so, yeah.
Kind of interesting.
I've got some other photographs of Alabamians who were in the regular army, and the photos I use of them are in their their regular infantry uniform. So you're right, and thanks for clarifying that. I even as I was saying it, in the back of my mind, I'm like, is that right? But I just kept going with my talk. But you're right. He was not matriculated at the University of Alabama. It was West Point.
Excellent presentation. I was curious whether or not in your research you came across many photographs depicting the damage in the state. I know there's quite a number of them that depict damage,
right,
like in Richmond and other places, but there's quite a bit of damage certainly caused during the last couple of months in Alabama. A lot had been caused for 2 or 3 years up in North Alabama. Did you find a lot of photographs depicting that, or was that rare?
I don't have any in the book. I've got other photographs of showing some other dead Alabamians at other battles or warships like the CSS Tennessee. I think the only building I have is where during the Jefferson Davis inauguration there was a photograph taken of that event. It's a great question. One I can't give you a good answer. I didn't come across many photographs of physical building damage. And those that I did come across, I couldn't clearly identify where it was or when it or what had happened there. So I ended up not putting any of those in. I do have a photograph of Fort Morgan and the damage that it sustained before it fell. But yeah, it would have been nice to have some more of those, because you're right, there's a lot for Richmond and Atlanta.
Do we have one more question?
Well, you're working the microphone, okay.
The flag in the reunion, did it survive? Is it part of our collection?
Yeah, and I mean, all you got to do is talk to Bob Bradley about these things, and he'll get you going on the flags. But I'll give my modest 2 cents. The flag, it was this 28th Alabama flag was captured at Orchard Knob, which was like a skirmish during the Chattanooga campaign. Prior to the Missionary Ridge attack, the 28th was on a kind of a forward, not quite a skirmish line, but like I don't know, some kind of position where they were very outmanned when the Yankees attacked, and they lost the flag. And then it was eventually returned. I've got here, I put it in, it's in the book, where it was acquired in 1905, thanks to the efforts of Director Thomas Owens at the time. And one of the veterans of the 28th is I.W. McAdory, who was an officer who was also a relative of Thomas Owen. And before this reunion, he beseeched Owen, who had just gotten the flag back to the state. He said, "We want to use it. We want to take it as part of our reunion." And Owen, grudgingly said, "All right, okay, I understand why you want it." So he loaned it to them. But it's here in our collection. We have it. You can. Along with a lot of other flags, too.
Excuse me. Sorry. We have one more question right here.
Thank you. In doing your research on the photographic history of Alabama in the war, what has it taught you about the character of the state and the people who fought in relation to the greatest conflict we've had as a nation and secessionism today, which many call for? Yeah, well, I don't know about many are calling for it, but it's... There's some venting going on with in that regard. I'm just I'm taken by just how committed Alabama society was to the war. The Unionist element notwithstanding, and certainly the African American population, but how the majority of white Alabamians were very committed to the conflict right to the end. Because you might not be aware of it, but there's an ongoing debate about the relative nationalism within the Confederacy, and by the second half of the war, where Southerners really committed to the cause, and battles or discussions and debates over the will of the people. And I find when I look at this that they're pretty committed to the whole conflict. I guess I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of. I'm just also amazed at just looking at individuals. And when people talk about what the war is about, we have to respect what they're saying it's about, because they're the ones that went through it, and they're not. Also, another part of the ongoing debate among historians, and I think within society in general, is you get this sense that because the Confederacy had the institution of slavery and was indeed, they were fighting to in part preserve that the Confederates are the bad guys. They're the evil. I don't look at the Civil War as good guys and bad guys, North good, South evil. Certainly, when you start looking at any of the images of some of these people, I mean, this guy's wrong, this guy's bad because the Confederacy happens to have slavery. I think slavery is an abhorrent institution, and I'm quite delighted it was destroyed in the course of this war. But you can't define these people solely by that. There's a heroic quality to them, and I was left with that impression as well.
Thank you for coming today. Dr. Severance will be here for a few minutes. He will sign your book if you have a book. His new book that's just been released, or he'll be glad to talk with you. So thank you again for coming and turn in your evaluation forms.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming.